The first time I ever held hands with a guy, I cried. And I laugh at it now, but it was not funny. It was not funny back then. I was so convinced that I had cheated on my future husband by holding hands.
Between belief and unbelief, faith and doubt, certainty and uncertainty, there is space. Each of us is thrown into this place to love, to ache, to rage, to heal, and to experience the wonder and the mystery of being. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the wonder and the mystery of being. This is episode 10, and it's all about purity culture. Now, you may or may not already know what I'm talking about when I say purity culture, but if you don't, it's basically a movement centered around sexuality in the church, specifically the way that people were taught to think about sexuality primarily in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So for people my age, growing up in the church, I very much grew up in the middle of purity culture. My wife did. A lot of my closest friends did. So this is something that affects very, very many people in the church that grew up in church, but also in secular situations, also in other faiths. And so I wanted to tackle this topic. It's one that I didn't feel like I personally was super qualified to speak on. So I wanted to speak to people that know a lot more than me about this. So I started talking to one or two people, and very, very quickly I discovered that there are very many threads to this issue. And it felt like the more I pulled, the more I found. And so what I ended up doing in this episode, it's formatted a little differently. Instead of it being a sort of casual conversation with one guest, this episode basically features segments from conversations I had with 4 different individuals. And the reason why I ended up doing it this way is because there were such rich perspectives from each of them that I felt like I wanted to convey them to you all in the most efficient and effective and meaningful format possible. So things in this episode are a little bit less of that personal back and forth and a little bit more of specific speakers talking on specific aspects of purity culture. So I wanted to introduce my 4 guests that I've got today. 4 guests. My first guest is Kay Klein. And she wrote a book called Pure, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. She's also the founder of Break Free Together. It's a nonprofit and community that helps people recover from purity culture. And Linda also does one-on-one coaching, helping people heal and recover from the trauma that they might have experienced in these kinds of cultures and on the issues that we're going to talk about today. My second guest, her name is Blair. She runs an account on Instagram called talkpuritytome, and I think that's maybe the most hilarious account name I've ever heard. And I've been following her for a number of months now, and she incorporates so much humor into this topic, which can be really refreshing because it can actually be quite a heavy discussion. So I really appreciate Blair's experience in dealing with this with a little bit of lightness and also sharing her very personal experiences on the issue. My third guest, her name is Meg. She's from New Zealand. You'll recognize that from her accent right away. And she is a sex and relationship coach who has a lot of experience, both personally and professionally, walking people through relationship issues. And she's found herself in this interesting space where many of her people that she coaches are also going through a process of religious deconstruction of some kind. And so in that process, she's found that healing from purity culture and going through a deconstruction process can sometimes go hand in hand. And so she has a very unique perspective in that way. And then my fourth guest, their name is Miguel Garcia, and Kevin has a really interesting perspective on this issue as they're a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And I really wanted to make sure that we were honoring the fact that when someone grows up in purity culture, if they happen to be non-cisgender, non-straight, if they happen to identify with a different orientation or sexuality than just the sort of cis, heteronormative way of being, that has some really unique implications as to how someone in that position would experience purity culture. And so I wanted to invite Kevin onto this conversation to share a little bit about that perspective with us. Okay, so I just finished editing this episode, and I felt like there was one last thing that was worth sharing before we get into the meat of the content today. And that is that nothing in this episode is intended to shame anyone, no matter your background, no matter your sexual experience, no matter the sexual experiences you chose not to have. In the same way that we don't want people to experience shame for their sexual desires or their sexual experiences, I also don't want people to experience shame if they have personally chosen more quote-unquote traditional sort of ways of living when it comes to sexuality. My wife and I, we waited until we were married to have sex, although I think we got by on a technicality on that one. But my point is, when I'm listening to these conversations, I don't receive any of this as an attack on the way that I did things. I receive this as information that's really helpful for us to know, so we can, my wife and I can continue to allow our relationship to evolve in ways that are hopefully becoming healthier and healthier all the time. So I just felt like that was worth saying. It's my hope in this conversation that we can address the topic of sexuality and purity culture in a way that recognizes that one size does not fit all, and each of our journeys are unique. And it's this idea of forcing everyone into the exact same picture of what a healthy relationship has to look like. That's what's harmful. So with that little caveat out of the way, please, I want to invite you to take in this episode and receive the things that are helpful to you. And if there are things in here that you don't feel like apply to you, just let them blow right by. So with that little caveat, I want to get started by defining what purity culture is, and I'm going to ask Linda Kay Klein to do that for us. So here's Linda Kay Klein.
I've increasingly started to see purity culture as something that's even larger than Christianity, something that shows up in certainly multiple religions. I know many Muslim people who I've been really amazed to see how similar the teachings that women receive within that culture are to the teachings of purity culture within the evangelical community, Mormons, Orthodox Jews. It's really quite widespread. And there are certainly cultures, non-religious cultures that teach these ideas. And let me be clear about what I mean by these ideas. The concept that people, and particularly women and girls, that their worth is defined by their quote-unquote purity, which is determined by other people, not a person's own self, right? By the standards of gender stereotype and gender expectations, which include sexual expectations such as non-sexuality before marriage and hypersexuality in marriage in order to please and pleasure the partner. So that's a concept and that's a culture that is quite widespread. What's unique, I think, about evangelical culture is this purity movement that I write about. This movement that started in the early 1990s and was really at its height in the early 2000s, that was largely funded by government money for abstinence only before marriage messaging, which was, at the federal and at the state level, that created this industry with purity rings and purity pledges and purity balls and purity curricula, and really took this concept of sexual purity that previously was part of the conversation for an adolescent in the community or for a young unmarried person in the community or an early stage married person, and increasingly made it the conversation and the marker of your being inside this community or being outside of it, of your being a Christian or a non-Christian, of your being worthy or non-worthy, of your being healthy, and being able to have a healthy, happy life, or if you're being doomed to a horrific, broken life here on earth because you are somehow, we're considered impure.
Mm-hmm. And I want to touch on one of the things you said in there, in that there's this expectation. It seems, it's both men and women and in the church, but it seems particularly leveled at young girls, that you should be completely non-sexual until you're married, and then all of a sudden flip this switch where sexuality goes from being this forbidden bad thing to being this thing that you are, a lot of expectations are put on you in this area in which you're expected to have zero experience.
Right.
Right. And so I think for a lot of, I think on one hand I want to say women, but I think across the board, I think for people that grow up in that culture, that switch from non-sexual, the expectations of being, totally non-sexual to being this sexual being that's supposed to, fulfill these expectations. It's just an impossible task, an impossible burden.
Right.
And
there's something really like almost pornographic about the whole idea of it to me, right?
Yeah.
Like this idea that somebody would have never even thought about it, right? What? What are you talking about? But then would be introduced to sexuality in a way that suddenly, everything opens and they are like a sexual tigress. Of course, that's a word that's used in the culture, right? Lamb in the day, tiger at night is the expectation for married women.
I don't know that I'd come across that phrase before. Is that
I'd heard lamb, so it came up in lots of my interviews. Lamb in the day,
Really?
tiger at night, or lamb before marriage, tiger after marriage. But usually lamb in the day, tiger at night was the expectation for married women. Yeah. Yeah. So which feels almost like a pornographic story to me, right?
Yes. Well, I'm trying to wrap my head around that phrase and it being used in a way that's like not satire.
So the reason I mention that it's almost pornographic in its nature, this kind of story, right, is because it is just that. It's a story. It's not something that's rooted in actual human development, certainly not in sexual development and what we know about sexual development. It's a myth, a concept, written by men about how we want sexuality to look. So that's why I bring up that the story, is almost mythical in description even, really.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at some of the sort of tropes of lamb in the day, tiger at night, you find them, more in the realm of fantasy and pornography than you find them in the realm of real life.
Okay, that was some really insightful thoughts from Linda. I also asked Blair from Talk Purity to me to sort of define purity culture from her perspective and also maybe give some examples of what how that played out in her life. And this is what Blair had to share.
Purity culture is this ideology that really emphasizes the importance of virginity, and, hetero-monogamous marriage as, the only place where sex should happen. And it really basically ties your worth to whether you can, not have sex until you get married, whether you can hold out and wait. And in the kind of late 80s into the 90s, early 2000s even, when I was going through it, there was all kinds of, cultural things within Christianity, like rings. I had a purity ring, these purity events like the D-Nows, the True Love Waits events, the Silver Ring thing, all those types of events. And it really is a combination of zero sex education and asking children to not have sex, which we will not educate them about, but we don't want them to do it.
Yeah, it's just like all you need to know about sex is no.
Yeah, I mean, I have some little funny stories even that I'll share. Like, I was so afraid of any kind of like relational affection or anything as an adult, like when I turned 18 and I was at college, the first time I ever held hands with a guy, I cried, like wept.
Like what?
Because
like sad cried or scared cried or happy cried?
Oh, I was so upset that I had cheated on my future husband.
By holding hands?
Yes.
Wow.
And like, I laugh at it now, but it was not funny. Like, it was not funny back then. I was so convinced that I had cheated on my future husband by holding hands with a guy that I liked. I was just, figuring things out. And I was like, I wanted to, it sounds so silly. Like, I realized how silly this is going to sound.
To me. It doesn't.
But just like from an outside perspective, I'm like, I get it. Like, I get that people would, but like, it was when, 12, I'm 30 now. So like 12 years ago, like when I was first at college and everything, I was like, it really was very traumatic for me, honestly, to feel that way. Like as an 18-year-old, I was like just trying to figure it out. But yeah, I was like so upset and like really thought that I had just disappointed God by doing that.
Thank you, Blair, for being so vulnerable with us and sharing that story and also your perspective on purity culture. I want to pass the mic to Meg now, and she has some thoughts that she shared with me about exactly how deep and how embodied some of these perspectives on sexuality and purity can sometimes go, and some of the implications that has for all of us. So this is Meg sharing some thoughts on that.
What's super, super interesting in this is Dr. Tina. She's at Dr. Tina's Shameless Sex, I think she goes under. She's great, love her. And she's my new clubhouse friend. She's awesome. But she talks about how she noticed in her, she's a sex therapist, right? And I'm not a sex therapist. I'm a coach around relational things and sex things, but she's a therapist on this. And so she talked about how she noticed like an uptake of people who've come through what we now call purity culture, and the way their bodies were holding tension and storing tension as if there was trauma, because we now know that it's really affecting your body like trauma in different ways. So it is very definitely a real thing that particularly women who've come through this culture are holding on so tight, and their body is physically bracing itself. So that makes it really difficult to get into a space where you feel relaxed enough and free enough to, have an orgasm and really enjoy that process. So it's definitely something that we need to talk about in that space. But I think the other thing in there, if we're getting nitty gritty, is that we've been taught through purity culture that sex is penis and vagina, man ejaculates, done.
Right.
Like that's the gold standard, right, for sex. That's what we've been taught. And actually, sex is a process. There's all these other ways that you can engage with sex, and that's intercourse, but there's all these other ways. But because we've been taught in purity culture, don't have sex, meaning don't have penetrative sex until you get married, we've created this as like the gold standard. And so, well, this is what you should be giving me as a husband, or this is what I should be providing for my partner. As a woman, I should be providing penetrative sex. Now, obviously, this is a very heteronormative cis conversation that we're having right here. So to all of our friends in spaces around that, please excuse that. But I mean, this is part of the purity culture discourse is that it is so heteronormative.
Yeah.
It is so much like, well, this is the ultimate goal, is penetrative sex. And so I think those are things that really have helped to frame how we think about pleasure and when is sex done, when the man ejaculates. That's been
that tends to be the sort of stereotypical way of thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it seems to me that a lot of the sexual expectations that arise out of a sort of purity culture mentality are very like centered on the man and his experience and his needs. I mean, I even like, I'm going to call someone out right now, like William Lane Craig, who's like one of the most famous Christian apologists. To this day, this is on his website. I checked it the other day because I was like, surely he's taken this down by now. But it's literally like telling women they should have sex with their husbands, even if they don't feel like it, because their husbands will basically, be nicer to them afterwards or like be more thoughtful to them. And that's just like, that feels so...
You're going to make me mad, John. You're going to make me mad.
I mean, I literally like someone mentioned that to me and I was like, well, surely he's taken that down. Surely he's realized how harmful that is. And I went and looked and it's on there.
I tuned into a relationship series from a large church in New Zealand that I know of. I was like, I'm just going to tune in out of interest and see what's going on here. And the guest speaker that they had in was still speaking about how men have a sexual need and the life of how long it takes to build up semen and all this in 72 hours. And I was like, maybe that's biologically something that goes on, but that does not mean that a woman has to support or take care of that as a need. Like it just blew my mind that it was still being, and this was a year ago.
Yeah.
In a relevant sort of church.
Well, I mean, I feel like I have my own feelings as to why that's such a bad way of looking at it. But like, could you like break down why specifically you feel like that's so harmful? Because I feel like you'd articulate it better than I would. Okay,
we might need another hour.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I mean, when you put the pressure on a woman, like let's just talk like real step back from it and not even on a biological level why It might be wrong or faulty. Because there's probably people that are better suited to speak to the biology points. But at a relational level, when you're putting pressure and when you're putting expectation on your partner to service a need that you have, and I'm not talking about you specifically, I'm talking generally here.
Nope, that's fine.
When you're putting pressure on your partner, there's a sense of obligation and that you're in it for yourself, and that's not a space that I don't think anybody would want to walk into. Like, would you want to walk into a space where your wife was saying, well, I expect you to do, I don't know, these things with the kids, and I expect you to do these dishes versus I expect you to, or I would love you to do this out of love. Like it's just a completely different thing. If someone is standing there begrudgingly vacuuming the floor or begrudgingly feeding the kids, you're like, no, I want you to do that with love. Like I want this to be a space where we all feel good and we're on a team, you know?
Thank you for those thoughts, Meg. And you mentioned trauma in there, and I wanted to ask Linda Kay Klein about sexual trauma as well, because for many people, purity culture really can be traumatic, and that trauma shows up in a number of different ways. And in Linda's book, Pure, sometimes it even shows up in situations that involve sexual assault. And so while it's heavy to talk about that, I think it's important to do so. So I asked Linda about that aspect of this issue. I wanted to ask you about some of the stories in your book. I mean, there were multiple. For those that haven't read it yet, there's a bunch of stories of people that you interviewed that are I mean, candidly, some of them are kind of hard to read because they're so gut-wrenching. I mean, for me, one of the ones that stands out is I think this person is identified as Laura. I can't remember if that's her real name or not. It doesn't matter. But she experienced a rape in college, and when she told her family, her father's first question was, "What were you wearing?"
Yeah,
and that, I mean, that wrecked me because I have a daughter, and I mean, my daughter's 2, so we're not having those kinds of conversations yet. But I mean, can you maybe tell us about some of the stories you've heard along those lines and ways in which, sort of the culture of purity interfaces with victims of sexual assault?
Yeah, it's incredible to me how often sexual assault comes up in my conversations with people. It is remarkably common, and heartbreakingly so. And Laura, whose story that you referenced, is actually one of the few people who elected to use her real name.
Oh, I think I remember you mentioning that now, yeah.
Yeah. And one of the reasons that she did is because she has since become an incredible activist. She did not receive justice, though this was a college-based gang rape, on campus or in the justice system, which is, very common. But the aspect of her story that she struggles with the most is that she wasn't seen and heard by her family. And so when it comes to the justice issue, she's been able to do some incredible work. She actually started an organization called Serve Justice that she has recently stepped away from and is now in private practice as somebody who works with people who were raped on campuses.
Wow.
And so
when I discovered the stats on how often that occurs, it's something like 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women will experience sexual assault on campus.
Yeah, I don't know if it's on campus. 1 in 4.
Oh, sorry, maybe not on campus, but is that
in general? Yeah,
in general. Yeah. That's terrifying.
Yeah, and in my experience, it would appear much higher than that. I actually think that that's potentially underreported. As somebody who people reveal that to. I think that there are a lot of people who hide it away and just never talk about it. But to go back to Laura, so she was able to do her healing work, in many ways around the trauma of the rape itself, via this justice work, but the deeper pain, right, that has lingered and that has been much more difficult to heal from is the pain from these lowercase t traumas of pre-shaming, right? Pre-shaming, by which I mean, the days that her mom would say, what are you wearing? You're trying to make people, you know what you're doing when you wear that, right? And she thought to herself, well, last year I was wearing it and you bought it for me and no one said anything. Like, who knew that this year it fit differently? Like, I'm not paying attention, right? So all these pre-shamings, pre-capital T trauma shamings, which are such a huge aspect of purity culture, this kind of quote unquote accountability culture, the way in which other people see it as their responsibility to hold you accountable to the expectations, including in ways that are certainly traumatizing in and of themselves, set her up to experience the kind of self-blame, upon the trauma that she experienced that is so common among survivors. And then she went to her family who, had, her father was a pastor. They were a very religious family. Purity culture was very much a part of her family life as well as, her church life and beyond. And she had those same ideas reiterated even in the moment in which she most desperately wanted to be seen. And I want to talk a little bit about how that happens.
Yeah, please.
So not only was Laura trained to blame herself when this happened, right? She was pre-trained to blame herself.
So like the trauma wasn't just in that moment. It was everything that came before that set her up to blame herself when that happened.
And everything that happened afterward when she lived in the realm of self-blame. Yes. And then, and in as much as that is true, her father also was trained to respond by shaming her. So let me talk a little bit about that. Yeah. In purity culture, there are certain things that are invisible. Certainly that were invisible in the height of the purity movement period that I really delve into most deeply. One of them is the LGBTQ experience, and another of them is rape, sexual assault, harassment, all of that, right? That whole world. Yeah. There are certain things that just aren't even talked about. And then, when those things appear, they are handled with the same rules of purity culture that we've learned are about sexuality, broadly speaking. Yep. And one of those rules, to bring it to sexual assault again, is, as you talked about before, you remembered when you were told that girls shouldn't wear spaghetti straps because it would make you struggle, right? It would make you have sexual thoughts.
A stumbling block.
A stumbling block, right? Yeah, exactly. So essentially, in this instance around the spaghetti straps, both you and the girls were learning that they were responsible for your sexual thought life, for your sexual actions, for whether or not you masturbated, right? And similarly, we learn the same thing about sexual expression. We learn that in action, we learn that women and girls are the keepers, right? It's their job to make sure that nothing sexual happens because men and boys have these sexual urges, which are part of their masculine gender expectations. So therefore, we have kind of complex feelings about them. We want them to have them, but we want them to control them. But, right. It's like, it's a complicated thing. So therefore, women and girls are taught you are the sexual keeper. You're the one who draws the boundary. You're the one who draws the line. So these kind of notions, are setting up men to have those expectations for women, not only for women to have those expectations for themselves. So then you get to the point where suddenly in a moment of trauma where your daughter desperately needs you, this trained response instead emerges. What were you wearing?
That's heavy. Sometimes this stuff can be really heavy. And sometimes sexuality is made out to be this huge thing in ways that maybe it shouldn't be. One of the things that Blair shared with me is her perspective on virginity and how virginity has been made into this big deal in ways that can sometimes be harmful. So I'm going to let Blair share her thoughts on that.
So, the concept of virginity, that, a penis coming in contact with a vagina changes that person somehow is a totally made up concept. Like I said, it really is meant to teach people that they're somehow changed or different, and that they should only basically have one person, have sex with one person. That's really what it's kind of designed to insinuate. And, medically, there's no value to really knowing whether someone's had sex or not, unless, there's some basically talking about like sexual activity or something. There's nothing about your body that really changes very much at all when you have sex for the first time. It doesn't really have any value outside of maybe some talks with your gynecologist or something like that. But a lot of people think that, like, you know, your hymen is always intact right before you have your first, you know, sexual encounter. But that's actually not even true either. Some people are born without a very, you know, they're born like kind of without a very large hymen or whatever. Like, it's totally fabricated, and it's meant to make people think that once they have sex, they're like forever changed by that person. And it puts so much control of a person's sexual experience on that first partner that, you know, somehow like they're gonna take on this. Even there's like spiritual implications of it too. Like, I know so many people, and this is still so common. Like, I don't know how to emphasize like how much people still think that, like, when you have sex with someone, you take on like their spirit, like
soul ties.
There's this, like,
I remember hearing
soul ties. Oh my gosh, that concept is alive and well. People still very much believe that, and I mean, I don't want to, you know, people can believe what they want to believe in terms of religion and stuff, but you don't take on the spirit of a person just because you have sex with them. Like, it blows my mind that people believe that. Like, I think it just shows too that we're taught to be so disembodied and like not in touch with our emotions through many parts of Christianity. Like, I don't know about you and your experience, but basically I was always taught that, like, if an emotion was good, it was from God, and that if an emotion was bad, it was, you know, from the devil or from my sinful nature. So is there like a bonding experience that can happen in sex? For sure. Like, I'm not going to pretend that that's not true. Like, for some people, it can be really bonding. I think that what people confuse for like an emotional connection, they then chalk up to like this soul ties idea. And that's, I mean, in Christianity, it's like we're so taught that just our emotions are not something to be considered, and there has to be this other, like,
don't trust your feelings. Don't trust your feelings. That is something that seems like it comes up time and time again in these conversations. And I'm sure that comes up even more so if someone happens to be sort of non-heteronormative, if someone is experiencing feelings for someone of the same sex or gender, or if someone feels like their gender might not be as clear-cut as someone like myself. And so I wanted to ask Kevin about purity culture from the perspective of the LGBTQ plus community, and this is what Kevin graciously shared with us.
I think it's interesting because I was kind of raised and socialized as a boy and a man growing up, and so that came with it a lot of factors. But I was also very feminine. Like, I've always, you know, kind of been a little bit of a fairy. And so me trying to be a dude, me trying to be a man after God's own heart, like, you know, trying to, you know, I went to Promise Keepers when I was 13 because I was hoping it would make me more masculine.
Wow.
Like, because I'm like, that's what men of God do. We do these things. A 13-year-old has no business being at first of all, no one has business at a Promise Keepers conference. They need to, like, oh, Jesus Christ, unless you guys promise to stop being dicks to each other. That's where you need to start. You guys are beating each other up. That's my little PSA for them. Anyways, I think I didn't recognize the signs of like what purity culture was, like many people, till much later. And I think that my deconstruction of like how much heteronormativity is just in the water of the world. I think heteronormativity and purity culture are honestly kind of one and the same in some ways, because it's not only just a sexual prescriptive, it's a relational ethic as well. It's saying that you can't have sex until you have it here because sex is sacred and it's only meant for this thing. And so it's like at the at the core message, like that's not necessarily a bad idea that sex can be sacred.
Yeah.
But it is when you make it a descriptive of how that sacredness can be expressed, in which constraints are then put on the body of Christ. If
Right.
you will.
Right. Yeah.
And so, if we're taking, for example, like, for me, I think the idea of needing to be a man who is married to a woman by a very specific age, especially if I was going to be a church leader, like that was just the model. And so even as a queer person, and this is the story of many a queer person who is, not like for me, like I'm attracted to men type folk. You don't strictly got to be a dude, but like that's the general area that I find myself pulled towards.
Sure.
So trying to date a cis woman who is very, very heterosexual and is like, that's her only thing, it was really, really tough, because it's like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And also, I had no metric for what love was supposed to feel like between a man and a woman. I was like, okay, so I love this person. And what I meant by that is like, I like spending time with them. They're really, really fun to be. We love going to church together. We love going to Bible study together. But also just like low key, like she was just kind of like my girlfriend and we made out. But like, I was still pretty femme-ish around her. I don't know how to.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And also,
I think sometimes like there's this, at least from the sort of hetero perspective, it's like there's this misconception that like you just emerged into adulthood fully understanding yourself, right? And that like in ways that you can articulate, right? And it's like I didn't emerge into adulthood that way, it's not fair for me to put that expectation on people that don't identify the way that I do, right?
Yeah. And so like and because of that, like when I was thinking, I was like, okay, so like we need to talk about, I need to ask about a ring size, because like I'm meeting her family, which means I got to start the engagement process, because like in evangelical world, like the dating to engagement to married time frame was like 9 to 12 months max.
Yeah, and something's wrong if it doesn't follow that track.
Yes, and so like I was very there for that, especially as a very repentant homosexual trying to like get it right. This was like my last ditch effort, but like what came up for me in that was like, we were on our way up to meet her family, and just something clicked on me as we were sleeping in the hotel room in separate beds because we were good Christians. But I just remember lying there like so wide awake thinking, I'm lying. I am lying to her. I'm lying to her that I want to have sex with her. That is something that she wants. Eventually she's going to want to have kids. And I don't know if I can do that. And also just like, I also want to have sex with boys. Like there's that thing that I keep saying that I'm over, but I'm not. That's a lie. And I don't think it's wrong that I want that. I keep telling myself that I'm. So it was, I think purity culture and queerness and, queer phobia and all of like the things, like I think they're all part of like a bigger umbrella of like toxic, heteronormative, patriarchal bullshit. It's all wrapped up in there for me.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it was really like, started off with like understanding racial justice a little bit, and then a little bit about feminism, and then a little bit about being okay with being queer. And then from there, I just got radicalized. And so it's like,
it's connected to so many things. And I keep finding this.
Because sex, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that like, even as I've been having these conversations, the whole reason I'm doing like a mega episode on this is because as I was pulling the threads on this issue, there kept on being more. And like, I mean, one of the things that I've, my wife and I have talked about is all the various ways that we had built-in expectations on our roles because I'm a man and she's a woman. And we've been revisiting like all of those recently. It's like, okay, hey, did we just assume that you would more, stay at home with the kids because you're a woman? Let's maybe revisit that. Like, did we just assume that I lead because I'm a man? Let's revisit that. Did we just assume that it's not okay to have friendships with members of other, other sex, other genders? Like,
men having sex, or men having not sex, men having friendships, platonic, good, respectful friendships with women.
Well, and sort of like, for a long time, the whole Billy Graham rule thing, like don't be in the room with a member of the opposite sex alone.
Unless your wife is there.
And it's like, I bought into that. And it's like, and now I look at it and I'm like, wait, are you saying that like you can't even be trusted to be in a room with someone? Like, is that what we're saying? Is that is normal?
And that's, I was just talking to one of my clients who's like a pastor said that to them as well, where it's just like, and also you got to be careful around, female worship lead pastor, Susie Q, because she's very attractive. And it's just like, what are you insinuating? And why are you projecting? Yeah. Because like, let me tell you what, the people who warn you about that are the people who struggle with it themselves. And it's just like, for me, it's like, I mean, as some, like, this is like the wild thing about this whole thing. And this is where I think like we see purity culture not just play out within the queer perspective, but like how this idea of a heteronormative marriage, and I think just the way that society has been and the church has built itself around the nuclear family of one man, one woman, 2.5 kids, siloing yourself off unless you are part of this bubble, which is like unto your own. Yeah. It's a part of a bigger system.
Part of a bigger system. That's an important thing to note, because purity culture is not just about sexuality even. It's about so much more than that. There are issues that come up within purity culture that involve gender roles. So expectations of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. Can women and men perform some of the same functions in certain situations? I mean, one of the things that frustrates me about some of the verses that Paul wrote in the New Testament is that they really seem to exclude women from leadership roles, from speaking in church, and it's pretty explicit. And some of those views have come all the way from 2,000 years ago to today, where we still see in so many religious circles male dominance. Or not just in religious circles, but in all kinds of circles we see male dominance. And in Christian culture, I feel like that's codified a little differently because it's so apparently supported in the scriptures. And so I wanted to ask Blair what her experience was in that regard.
Obviously, like within the confines of Christianity, I really saw my natural like leadership abilities and like assertiveness as sinful, and like I tried to like squash that as much as possible because, I can't, if I want in any context to have like a position of leadership or power over any man, that is, that is my sin nature, and I mean, it's not easy to walk that back, as an adult, to try to figure out, like just to try to value myself, even just to value like my abilities and realize that, I think that so many people who don't grow up in this environment, like have the opportunity to really develop those skills even. And like, I don't feel like I was able to do that because I spent so many years thinking that was like a vice of mine, that like I would have to like give that to the Lord and like let him like, help me be more submissive and like learn my place type thing. And, learn that I was going to have to, give up the natural, inclination I have to like be a leader.
So has it been sort of like was it a gradual thing for you that you sort of felt like you started to gain this increasing sense of permission that like, no, it's okay that I am this way, and it's okay that this is who I am, and actually it's not just okay, it's good. Was that like a gradual thing for you, or?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was more gradual. Like as I started, leaving church communities, like I stopped. I did the whole thing of, I don't go to church anymore, but I'm still a Christian. Like I still, I still believe, I prayed, I, still listened to worship music. I still thought basically all the same things. I took the step of, I didn't go to church anymore. And like, as I got more in communities where, you know, people didn't have that mindset, like, and encouraged me in the areas they saw I was strong in with, you know, just like, you know, critical thinking, problem solving, things like that. Like, people started encouraging me in that, and that hadn't really happened before. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, I'm good at something, and like someone else recognizes it in me, and like I get to like now work to be even better at that. Like, that's never happened before. Like, it was just you know, and then I started like, yeah, just like giving myself like room, I guess, and like trying to explore that more. And just, I don't know, it's hard to explain, like, when your world was so small for so many years, like what it feels like to have that like open up as an adult. Like,
yes,
it's hard to explain it I don't know. Like, I just don't feel like in some ways I feel like my life has started in the past like 5 years. You know what I mean? Like,
I know what that feels like. Yeah.
Like, everything before was just like, I just felt so small, and I felt so like that there were so many things wrong with me for so many years. And now it's like, oh, wait, no, that's just like actually called being a human. Like, there was nothing wrong with me. It was just like, I was a person who like had emotions, and like was always told those were bad. And like, that's what that was.
So we've identified a number of ways in which purity culture can be really harmful. And actually, we've sort of just scratched the surface here. There's so much more that we haven't talked about. But I wanted to, at the same time as recognizing the issues, I wanted to also focus on healing and restoration and how people can go about healing and being restored, who've experienced purity culture and who maybe feel like they're carrying around some negative effects from it. And so I asked all of our guests about that, and this is what they had to share.
What I find the beginning of the healing work is, it actually starts with teaching people to feel their feelings. You know, in this culture, feelings are highly regulated.
Yes.
and often by gender lines. So women aren't allowed to experience anger. Men aren't allowed to experience sadness. Nobody's allowed to experience happiness. That means you're probably sinning. There's probably something horrible that you're doing and selfish that you would be happy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I laugh about that, but that is something that my wife and I have talked about a lot, because for her, so many times where she's experienced happiness, she's been suspicious of her own happiness.
Absolutely.
Like, oh, I probably shouldn't be okay with this because it makes me feel good. And if it makes me feel good, it's probably bad.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like that's an example of how this is so much more than just sexuality, even though it's very sexually oriented.
Yes. And it shows up in sexuality, but it shows up also everywhere else.
Yeah. And this is an area in which I see it showing up, you know, for all genders.
Yes.
You know.
Yes. The happiness teaching, right? Instead, you're supposed to experience joy in the Lord. And joy in the Lord is the joy that we are taught comes from suffering, but finding joy in the Lord anyway.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of forced smile is sort of what we're taught to have.
It's a glorification of suffering.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, to continue though briefly. So
please do.
Yeah.
Please do. Sorry if I interrupt at times. I get really interested in particular things you say. So
no, it's good.
Yeah.
It's good. I just wanted to say the reason I start with feeling your feelings is because, you know, before we can even get to the point of trusting our guts, trusting our instincts. Our instincts are kind of thoughts and beliefs, that kind of realm. Oftentimes we can't even identify our own thoughts and our feelings and our own beliefs, right?
Oh, for sure.
So we start with identifying and allowing our feelings. We move then into, what those feelings reveal to us about what we think, about what we believe, and so on and so forth.
From the conversations I've had along the topic of purity culture, it does seem like evangelical Christianity sometimes can, at least in the time that we were coming up, like sort of 90s, early 2000s, there was this culture of like disconnection from our own bodies and from our sexuality. How do you feel like, in your view, like how do you feel like you reconnect with that?
Yeah, so I find this really fascinating because I grew up in like a Pentecostal Baptist church for the early parts, and I don't know exactly if Baptist is the same there as it is to us here, but it was a happy clappy, kind of church. And so on one hand, it was quite embodied, like we could clap, we could move, and then I was on church staff for a lot of years, and it was the same thing. Like everyone was jumping around, and it was in one sense embodied. And yet when it came to sexuality, there was like a fade to black kind of thing that happened. And it's like, no, we're not connected to that. We just, that is good for one day in marriage. And so in terms of practices of coming back home to your body, I actually love using movement. I love, and I know that's not as easy for everybody, but maybe it's like some yoga or some dance, or maybe it's a walk in nature, but there's various different ways that different people are going to connect to it. But actually moving your body in ways that are not everybody jump, you all have to do this. It's like, no, I'm going to feel into what feels good in me and how I want to move my body right now.
Yeah.
I find that a really interesting tension.
No, that actually makes a lot of sense, because one of the things my wife has gotten into this year is roller skating, like 70s full on, like hippie. She's not wearing bell bottoms, which is fine with me. I'm fine if that trend doesn't come back.
I saw the Instagram stories. I'm like, girl, if I could spin like that, that's amazing.
Well, I mean, so most of our house is sort of just one big room, or it's not that big. We're in California. We have a small house, but she just sort of skates around the dining room table, and I'll come in from work sometimes, and she'll just be skating around, and the way she describes it is so interesting to me, because on one hand, it's like, it's sort of just a hobby, right? It's just like you like roller skating. But on the other hand, she's like, I feel so much more connected with my body. I love to move. Something about it feels spiritual. She said that one time, even in a stage where, spirituality, we're not always sure what that means to us. We're still sort of figuring that out. But I totally agree with you about moving your body. Like, there is something about that does seem to be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks really different for different people. Like, I remember probably 4 years ago now when I started going to the gym, and there's a whole other story around that. I had 10 years of chronic illness and chronic pain, and so any kind of strenuous exercise was chaos. So that's a whole other podcast.
Sure.
But that process of getting better and getting my body to a point where I felt like I could trust it to do heavy, hard things, that in itself was really therapeutic. I remember lying on this particular bench press, and I got a trainer because I really wanted to like do it well and safe and things. And I remember just crying, and I was like, what is happening? But it was that process of moving my body through, letting my body know it's okay, it's safe. Like, this is a good burn, this is a good weight. You can do this. And I wasn't in a place of pushing. I was really tuned in. I was listening. But I just remember having this incredible moment through something as simple as pushing some weights,
Yeah.
For me, being able to laugh and like find the humor in all of this has been so important in my healing. And, you know, even everything from, you know, like you mentioned, the name of my account is Talk Purity to me. Like
much.
You know what I mean? Like from the very beginning, I was like, I was not, you know, going to be the type of account that's just like I just have like a different style. I have a more like sort of snarky like personality anyway. Like that's just kind of my vibe. And I think it's been, I mean, people really respond to it because when you leave it, you have to see how ridiculous it all is in a lot of ways. Like, it's not ridiculous when you're in it, so I don't want anyone to like feel bad. You know, I was totally sold out to the whole thing. So like, it wasn't ridiculous when I was in it, but when you take a step back, you have to see how absurd it is to have, you know, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids saying they're never going to have sex, but they're children. Like, you have to see how ridiculous all of it is. Like, you have to see how silly it is to base your entire lifestyle and personality over whether or not you want to have sex. Like, it is laughable. And, you know, it's not laughable when you're deep in it, but I've just found it, you know, there's just so many things that I'm like, this is just, it's bananas. Like, you have to just see.
Look, sex can be beautiful, connected, sacred kind of experience. It can be that. It can also be awkward, and it can also be messy, and it can also be like not amazing today. And it can also be all kinds of things. Like, there's an Australian blogger who went viral years ago for writing an article about parent sex, right? And how it's that quick sex you have with one foot on the door and toddlers banging on the outside. Great article. And Constance Hall is her name, and she's hilarious. But that article about, I'm like, there's so many different kinds of sex. There's kinky sex. I mean, we haven't even dug into that part and how that plays into purity culture. There's all different flavors of sex, and we've not often had the scope to go, I want to play around with this. I want to experiment with this. I want to have some fun with this. And so bringing that fun and bringing that variation in, I think, is really important.
Look, there are so many reasons why we'd want to know more about this issue and to experience healing in this area, not just for ourselves, but for those of us that have children like I do. There's this real desire to raise our kids with a healthier perspective on sexuality. I know that's really important to me. And so I wanted to ask Linda specifically what her perspective was on raising children and how to broach the issues of sexuality in a way that's helpful and not harmful. And this is what Linda shared with us.
A common misconception is that, you know, we're all screwed up. So, you know, never mind about us, right? But we're going to do it right for our kids, you know, the next generation, you know. And, you know, unfortunately, kids learn very little from what their parents say. They learn a lot from the modeling that their parents do, right? So
that's a very good point.
Yeah. So our children learn more about sexuality from, you know, you even mentioned when you were thinking about all the covert ways in which these things are communicated. They learn from what we don't talk about. They learn from our discomfort. They learn from the stories that we, you know, tell about ourselves that they are picking up on. They learn from the stories we tell about other people, right? So you know, the really foundational work is about doing this deconstruction on ourselves and starting to really identify what we've learned and pull it apart. And then, you know, only then can we for ourselves start to get, you know, ready to do the work of reconstruction, ready to say, what are my sexual ethics, right? What do I believe about sexuality? What do I believe about selfhood? And those kinds of things, are going to be seeping out of your pores, And so the real kind of first work has to be, don't skip yourself, right? Start with yourself. And I know you and your wife are doing that.
Point. Oh, that's such a good point, because I do sort of recognize that this whole we're a lost cause, but maybe we can do better with our kids thing. that is actually connected to this whole idea of suffering in a way, right? Because it's like, oh, well, I can't expect a healthier, better life. I need to just focus on my kids. And you make a really good point that our example of how we live our lives is the most profound thing we're going to impart to our kids. And I think that's true. I mean, the what we do will speak more to them than even what we say.
Absolutely.
So I'm so glad you brought up that point and reframed the question that way. It's really, 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 really great.
Yeah.
And you said you had 2 points, so I wanted to remind you of the other one.
Yeah. So, but to the question around how do you have these conversations? I'm a big believer in, this is a very common, kind of a piece of advice, but I'm a big believer in not one single conversation.
Yes, I totally agree. Yep.
Right? Many, many small conversations as they come up. And in a way, the many, many small conversations also are doing the work to show that we are not experiencing shame around sexuality, and that sexuality isn't shameful, right? I don't have to tell you to avert your eyes every time, anything appears on the screen. I could say, wow, how did seeing that kiss make you feel?
Interesting.
Yeah. There are sort of small ways in which we can normalize sexuality. That scene in that movie, what do you think about how he treated her?
Wow, that's such a good point. But I mean, both my wife and I, and probably most people that grew up in the church, have had the experience of, you're watching a movie, everything is fine, and then the one sexually charged scene in the entire movie comes on, and somehow one of your parents just happens to walk in at that moment.
Right.
and runs in front of the screen. No. Like, don't look at this. Parents just have a sixth sense for that kind of thing, it seems like. But yeah, I mean, I guess I hadn't thought about the deeper implications of those moments, of what you're saying when you obscure the screen and say, no, hide this, don't look at that. There are things that you're teaching your kids when you do that without meaning to.
Right, and even if something is beyond their developmental stage, you could say that. You could say, "Oh, you're not quite old enough to see this yet." Right? But in a way that allows them to still know that it's something you're able to talk about, which allows them to increasingly come to you with questions, And that's where the real stuff of learning is going to happen, not with anything you tell them, but with how you are when they begin to come to you.
Yeah, I think you've got a fire there.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Yeah, there wasn't actually a fire. Linda lives in New York City, and well, actually, maybe there was a fire, but it wasn't at Linda's place. So, the last thing I wanted to address here is for people who are actually members of the LGBTQ plus community, but are not out yet, and maybe offer some thoughts to any of you who are in that position. Obviously, I am not super qualified in this area, so I wanted to ask Kevin to share their thoughts and their perspectives on being a member of the LGBTQ plus community and coming out of purity culture in your own time. Here's Kevin.
I think people who are not straight and don't know what to call themselves, who are wrestling with sexuality or gender identity questions, first of all, take a fucking deep breath. You're fine. I know it seems really fucking scary right now and you feel really alone, but you're not. There's a whole shit ton of queer Christians out here and post-Christians and all sorts. There's also queer Muslims and queer Jews and queer Sikhs. There's queer everybody. You know what is so beautiful about being queer, among other things, is that it literally connects us to every culture throughout time and history. There are queer people in every culture. Huh! What a gift. Anyways, that just gets me really fired up and happy to remember.
Well, that touches on something too that like is just a constant theme in this whole space, and that like you're not the only one.
Yeah.
And that's it's a simple but a powerful
you're
thing
definitely
to
not
realize.
Like you feel like you're not the only one because like you think that the words gay and Christian or queer and Christian can't go together. But then like you Google it for the first time and it's like, holy shit, there are books about this.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, like I do have a few recommendations. If you're coming from evangelicalism and you need like a Bible-based argument for this, start with God and the Gay Christian by Matthew Vines. It's a really, really great resource that tackles it from the perspective that I needed because I had biblical primacy or like the Bible is inerrant. I really need that. So like if you are there and you need the inerrant Bible to affirm your queerness, start there. And then you can start to continue. You'll find a whole bunch of other good stuff, but that's where I start people with. The second one I would start with is if you need something a little bit more story-driven, check out Torn by Justin Lee, another great one. And if you are just somebody who's questioning the Bible and what it says about queer people and purity culture, just Google us. We've got plenty of resources. But I think starting there and arming yourself with a little knowledge and really asking like, okay, the way that I've been doing this is making me miserable, is it not? If the way that you're doing your faith is making you miserable, that is data to respond to. Yeah. So if it's making you miserable, why not try something different that might make you feel wonderful? That may give you an insight to like maybe there's a different, better way to be a person of faith, different way of being a Christian, because you know what? Like, life is too short. You only get how many years on this planet? Stop staying miserable. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be this way, and a better way is possible. Shit.
It doesn't have to be this way, and a better way is possible. I love that quote, and I'm going to be remembering it all day today. So thank you all so much for watching and for listening. This has been a bit of an experiment, this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope the flow was good for you. And I hope you learned from listening to it as much as I did from making it. I would really encourage you to check out all 4 of our guests that we had this week. You can check out Linda Kay Klein on her website, lindakaycline.com. She's also on Instagram. And again, her book is called Pure, and I would really encourage you to check it out. It's an incredible book. Blair from Talk Purity to Me, you can find on Instagram at Talk Purity to Me. It's not exactly an easy handle to forget, so pretty easy to find, and check out all of her content there. Meg Cowan, you can check her out at megcowan.com is her website. And on Instagram, she's Meg C. Cowan. And also Meg hosts Clubhouse chats every weekend centered around the topic of deconstruction and evolving faith perspectives. There's a number of panelists from a wide variety of theologies and perspectives represented on this Clubhouse chat. I've participated in it a number of times, and it's a really, really beautiful community around the sort of deconstruction and evolving faith space. Here in the US, it's on Sundays at noon and 3 Eastern. If you're in New Zealand, where Meg is, it's 9 a.m. on Monday morning, and that's where you can check out those Clubhouse chats. My last guest, Kevin, you can check them out on Instagram at the username Miguel Garcia, and also, I believe, thekevingarcia.com. And Kevin also has a book called Bad Theology Kills, and again does spiritual reformation coaching. And honestly, just follow Kevin on Instagram. You'll get so much even right there. So thank you so much to all my guests today. It's been a real journey making this episode, and I hope that you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Until next week, I'll see you next week. I don't know where I was going with that. I will see you next week. Thank you for watching and listening. Until then, stay curious.